Hi, YouTubers. So I decided to give a little talk about sexuality and genetics. And the reason that prompted me to give this is because I read some articles recently, which was a little bit disturbing, um, and I didn't necessarily agree with. And they basically were suggesting that there's a genetic factor that is predetermining what people's sexuality is. Whilst I agree that that might be of some consideration and it might play some part, I think the reports that I read seem to overstress the role of it, and actually the environmental impact and our surroundings and our social upbringing is one factor also to consider. But I think also our choice as well, and I think that's what concerns me most, is that this whole ideology of predeterminism, the fact that we are determined by our genetics, seems to remove any volition, any choice that we might have. Um, so these articles were actually talking about paedophilia in particular, and that some people might have a genetic link, so that they are more likely to be attracted to children as an adult. And there are various different psychological studies that are supporting these claims. My theory actually is that I would say that it's possibly to do with whatever's happened to them, their life experiences. But I think also you have to think and look logically at the choice of it. But before I go on to talk about paedophilia, actually, I think it's relevant to look at other sexualities as well, because it's actually the genetic component is actually a very interesting angle when you look at all sexualities, and actually is a broader issue when you look at other issues like mental health. So if we look at something like homosexuality or bisexuality, for example, it's been argued for a long time, actually, by many people, that people are determined to become a sexuality because of their genetic predisposition. I think there's that famous song by Lady Gaga, isn't there? I was born this way, which is heralded as some sort of anthem of some people at least. And I've heard about it, having attended so many gay pride marches over the years and frequenting many gay bars and many house parties. So many people have stressed the genetic determinant factor that they believe you're born with a sexuality and you can't choose it. Um, well, actually, I would dispute that, and where I have in the past, I'm afraid I've gotten into some sort of trouble and some sort of debate, and some of the debates ended up in some sort of argument, and some ended up with us seeing each other's viewpoints a little bit more, or nevertheless perhaps still disagreeing. Um, but I would say before you can say whether or not there's a genetic component to sexuality, you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to have a sexuality? Is it just simply the act of being around someone, of being close and physically with them? Or is it actually more than that, an attraction that you have to people? And if it was the case that some people are genetically predisposed, um, then it would mean you would probably see that across all different cultures, across different continents. You would expect to see that genetic diversity. Why would it be that in some cultures there's more of it and in some cultures there's less? Unless there is a cultural and social reason that could impact it too. But it's actually really hard to know because on such a taboo issue, and in some countries it's much more taboo than in others, it's therefore quite hard to gather reliable statistical evidence. So who's really going to come out and say that they have homosexual feelings in a culture perhaps where there's a lot of negativity, a lot of prejudice, and there's a lot of, rightly or wrongly, a lot of feelings against it. It will be quite hard to get accurate information, perhaps, in many areas. So I think in terms of the poverty of the information, it's probably going to be quite hard to arrive at a definitive answer. But your evidence is always your own life experiences. And so I can talk about mine where they're relevant. And I've been fortunate to meet many different people and to find out about their lifestyles and the type of backgrounds they've had. But that's only at least second hand. That's only relying on how honest they are with those things. And it's quite hard to sort of know accurately everything about someone's life without intimately being connected with them. And you can only really truly know a handful of people like that, probably, unless you're devoting yourself to sociological studies, and you've got methods that are very good for that as well. I personally think, from my own personal perspective, that it was a combination, actually. It may be that there was a genetic component, but I actually think, for me personally, the reason that I have lived, well, my story is that for many years, I had some relationships with women and some with men, but for a long time, there were 5 main relationships with men, and there were a large number of one-night stands as well, mostly with men. And I think that was actually partly a social position that I was in. And I think that there was a certain element of where I grew up and that influencing me to be like that, because it's something in the culture that I'm in where it's acceptable, something where it's there's pride, where it's advertised, something where it's not totally but increasingly seen as something more acceptable than it was. And I think perhaps if I'd grown up in a different culture, it might be different. I think for me as well, actually, lacking a strong maternal bond at an early age could have, I would think, probably played some sort of influence on that. So if you're not having that close relationship with a motherly figure, and that's something you struggle with, it's possible that you might then struggle to have relationships with women in a way. I think also, like, I had a variety of mental health issues as well, and I think for me it was also partly choice, or whether that was an unconscious choice to some degree. The idea that having a woman in a relationship, and also having a child and the potential for a child within that, I think for me, looking at it, you would want to be in a position where you're able to support both your partner and the child in practical sense, but psychologically, where you can be dependable, where you are someone to provide for them and to be someone that's there to sort of help emotionally and also practically. And I think if you fear, and your genuine feeling is that you're not in that position, and I think it would seem and feel pretty negligible to have a child and bring it into that environment, in fact. Well, of course, in a relationship with a man, of course, there's a zero chance of any pregnancy or children relating from that, at least. So I think for me, I'm not sure it was a conscious choice at first, to be honest. But I think it was a combination of struggling to relate to women and not being around women enough, and not having that strong maternal influence at an early age. And that combined also with that sort of increasing realization that I wasn't able, I wasn't in a fit position mentally to provide a stable family unit. I have had a life that's been all over the place, in and out of different houses and jobs. I grew up in a care home, which was fragile, and it had a certain degree of good things about it, but there were also things that were a bit upsetting and I struggled with. And I think that it wasn't, therefore, an ideal situation where I would be able to sort of go on and provide for other people. I've been in and out of work. I've had times of being in psychiatric wards, times of being on the streets or sofa surfing. And, that's just not a position where you're able to function properly as a father or a husband, and you're not able to provide that support. Nevertheless, I was able to have some relationships despite that, and grateful for those, I think, actually. And I think that it seemed, I'm not sure if I was consciously doing that and avoiding relationships with women because of that, but I think that certainly was a part of it for me. So, and I've had 10 years now of abstinence where I haven't had relationships with men or women, actually, and that's been quite interesting, actually, and I think it's that time that's given me an opportunity to look back in hindsight and sort of revisit old memories and see why I got to where I was, and to think more consciously, what had led to that. And so I think from my perspective, the environment, the cultural and social influences absolutely played a part. But I think more essential than even that is that it was my choice, in fact, and that I found that there were productive relationships where I was able to have a close companionship, where we were able to sort of share time together, where we could benefit from each other. And I think that there were probably 5 relationships I had where there was a certain degree of mutual caring about each other, where we fostered a good relationship, which had, on balance, probably more good than bad about it, and which is why it probably lasted so long. One was 2 years, I think, and I think one was a few months, another one was just shy of a year, another one, again, a few months, and another one was about a few months too. So, but they were all meaningful relationships. They were all really friendships that were more intimate, actually, to be honest. So I think that for me personally, and I'm not saying this is for everyone, it may not be. It may be that for other people, maybe the genetic component plays a much bigger role for all of them. I'm not saying it is the same. It certainly can vary a lot, that. So I do, it's sort of impossible, really, and I'm wary of making generalizations because of the poverty of the information, because it's really hard to know. I haven't gone out and done surveys of massive numbers of people, and you would need to in order to sort of accumulate enough knowledge for it to be comprehensive, and to study people from different backgrounds and who've grown up in very different positions, and then cross-reference those different positions to see how that then relates in terms of their relationships. But essentially for me, it's always a choice. It's like the sexuality was a choice. I could have chosen just to be single and not to have any relationships. But it was a choice back then, albeit not necessarily as a conscious choice as it was. And when I stopped having any relationships, and in fact I got into a really bad spell where I was having a string of one-night stands, and unfortunately, that was a bad time for me in my life, and I realised that it really was something that I was doing and not getting anything out of. I was using other people and being used, really. And something that I got stuck in a rut of doing, I suppose, really. Looking for love in the wrong places, I suppose that's what I would call it. And, it was just like doing a drug, and it was just a quick fix, feel good for a moment, but quickly you felt it just didn't last, and it didn't leave you with any emotional connections that were lasting, or it wasn't nourishing, it wasn't. So it eventually got to a point where I stopped and I ceased all that kind of thing. I just felt it was something that I felt ashamed about, really, and I felt, why am I doing that, And so I was glad that I stopped that. It was a conscious decision at the time. I felt that I wasn't mentally sound, and that I was engaging in risky behaviours too, increasing the risk, going back to strangers' houses, not protecting myself properly. And I felt like, that there were some really bad decisions that were made, quite frankly, looking back. And but I think I made choices in my life. Some of the choices, I'm not going to demonize homosexuality. I made some choices that I'm glad I did. I met people that richly rewarded my life and have been vastly improved because of those experiences. And I've got a whole lot of warm and fond memories to indulge in, actually. And I'm glad to have had those encounters. And those ones were where there were meaningful relationships, in fact, where we invested time and energy and we really got to know each other. It wasn't just purely based on sexuality. It was based on an emotional relationship. I would say we were like friends, in fact, So it was that kind of level. And I feel glad to have had those relationships. And I don't feel any regret, actually, from those, actually. Where I do feel regret is where there were sort of like casual, shallow, just physically based relationships that didn't have that same emotional nurturing, that were just really about indulging in gratification, and that's what I was reduced to be honest with you. And it lasted for a year or two, where I was drinking heavily. I was going out. I was in a foreign city where no one knew me, so there was a degree of anonymity there, I suppose, under the cover of all that. But I didn't feel good for doing it, in fact. So I'm wondering why I prolonged doing it. And it was only when I stopped drinking so much, when I started working more, I had a long period out of work, where I started getting back into doing other things and other relationships, therefore. Relationships through work, through voluntary groups, through friends of friends as well, that weren't based on sexuality, that were based more on various interests and hobbies and other things that connected us. So I started to realise, you don't have to have that sexuality. It's not something that's a necessary part of life. You can have a fulfilling, rewarding lifestyle without any sexuality. So for me, it was a great thing actually to be freed from that. I suppose it was sort of liberation, really. I was like a prisoner with my own key, really. But I didn't realise for a long time I was imprisoned by my own false ideologies that I'd accepted, where I told myself that I needed this, or it was something that helped me, when it didn't, of course. A bit like drugs and a bit like heavy drinking, really. It's similar kind of thing. So it was a choice, but there were bad choices at the same time. There were good and bad choices in terms of the sexuality that I went through. So I don't want to demonize it, but I also don't want to look back and say it was all good, because there were a lot of really bad things and a lot of really bad choices. But that's my fault. I didn't do the hard work. I didn't take enough time to sort of actually spend time with myself, truly investigating myself and asking myself, why was that? And looking back at the childhood and looking back at my life and why that could have been, and also looking forwards and making a commitment to sort of changing and to trying to adapt and connect to people in different ways. So that's my own story anyway. And I am very much glad to have been alone, but I also kind of feel like it would be nice to have a relationship as well. And it's something that, I want to be more conscious about choosing and doing it more for the right reasons now. So it's not based upon using others or feeling used by them, actually. So it's a mutually beneficial thing. So anyway, I really do feel that this whole element of removing someone's choice and saying that it's not a choice and you can't help it, I feel that is a bit of a cop-out, really. Of course, there's an argument you can't choose who you're attracted to, perhaps, but you can choose your actions, certainly. Nobody would force you to go out and meet someone through a website or a nightclub or wherever and sort of strike up a relationship with them. Except in rare examples, mostly it's something you choose. Okay, you don't always have that same knowledge. You're not always conscious why you're making those choices. And certainly where we're more likely to make ill-informed choices. I know I was. And so I think we mustn't shirk that responsibility of making a choice. And where we overemphasize the genetic role in identities, and looking too much at the determining factor, then we're likely to say we don't have any choice in how we think and what we pay attention to, and also where our thoughts lead to actions, and where we go out, who we meet, what we see, how we arrange our relationships, on what basis, how we engage with other people, how responsible we decide to act, what choices we make, and so I'm not saying that the genetic impact doesn't exist. I'm saying it may well be an influence, but I think we must be cautious about not overemphasizing it too much, and realizing that we do have choices in life. If we realize we have an attraction to someone, okay, we can choose whether we think about something or not. We can choose whether we view certain websites or videos or read certain books or magazines. We can choose what we invest and pay attention into, right? So it is partly a matter of choice to some degree, what you're attracted to, and how much time you spend towards what you're attracted to. if you find you're attracted towards something that you don't like or is unhealthy, you can choose to distance yourself from it and to find other things that are healthier and that are better for you in life. So that's a really important thing for me, actually, the element of your choice, because that empowers us. Therefore, we are able to have some degree of control and some degree of choice over what we do, who we meet, how we meet them, when we meet, and what we say. So how does this relate in sexuality, though? So, and actually, if I look at it from homosexuality, a lot of people have argued that why it's that it's the reason there's a sorry the fact that it's not a choice, that means that it must be therefore moral. That's been a big argument from some people. It's you're born with it, therefore God has made me this way. Therefore it must be right. But of course, that in itself, the fact that you might be born genetically with something, that doesn't make necessarily something a good or wholesome thing. Some people are born with various handicaps, and I'm not trying to equate that, because that's not that. But I think also, so the fact you're born with something doesn't make it a right thing in itself, actually. Some people are born with various disabilities, or mental or physical. So that in itself doesn't make it right or wrong. But I think as well that there's another argument that's often used as part of this genetic persuader, and that is, well, I can't help it. This is something that I have to live with. There's no choice for me. It's this or I must be alone in that. But actually, the clearly, I personally feel that there can be a choice. That what you pay attention to, if whether you're attracted to something or not, you can choose how much time and energy you give to that, whether you endorse that thing or not, in fact. And I think, if you find that it's an attraction to something like paedophilia that's really wrong, then you absolutely have a choice to refrain from doing it and to not engage in anything like that, to not look for certain books or websites or films or things that would promote that. I think there's this funny thing with homosexuality that a lot of people would say, they use the argument from a moral point of view, saying it must be moral, without considering the God element. They say it must be moral because this is the way I was born. This is we were genetically predisposed to be like this. And there may be that factor of genetics, yes, but that doesn't, whether something is genetic or not doesn't make it right or wrong. And in fact, you could choose something and it still be right or wrong. So what I mean by that is, like, there's this argument that, oh, well, if I had the choice, I wouldn't have chosen to be homosexual or to have any homosexual relationships, right? But I don't have the choice. And whereas for me, I did have the choice. And actually, I made some good choices with that. And I made some bad choices, because there were some very good, healthy, productive, sustaining relationships. And there were some really bad, destructive, shallow, ridiculous ones that actually were bad choices, really. And I think that idea of you make the choice, that for me is a good one, and it's empowering. But this idea of, well, there's no choice to be made in it. I was born this way. I just feel that to me is a bit of a cop out, because you could say I chose to have these relationships. I could have been celibate. Nobody forced anyone. And, there are rare circumstances where people are sexually abused or raped or coerced into relationships, sadly. But for the most part, for many people, the idea that nobody forces you to actively go out and seeking relationships, to join gay youth groups, to visit gay nightclubs, to go on Tinder or Manhunt or whatever sites, or to meet friends of friends. No one actually makes you do those things. You actively decide and consciously choose to do those things. You may not know why, or you may not give enough thought to it, for sure. But it's still a choice, you know. And I think actually, I think it actually plays into a homophobic point of view to say that there's no choice in it, because that says, well, why would you choose it? You know, there can't be any good thing in it. And I actually think there are some redeemable good things about it, and that you can have some wholesome relationships that are homogenous, that are homosocial. And even heterosocial people have homosocial relations, in fact, like a bromance where they're very close to other guys, and that. It's not of course, it's a very different relationship than one that it also involves a sexual component. But the idea of saying that there's no choice could also be argued, that's a very homophobic belief, because why would you choose something if it wasn't good? If it was, but that's almost starting from the premise it's a bad thing to have any of those relationships. So therefore, because they're bad sort of relationships, or they're inferior relationships, no one would choose it for themselves. So it really does sort of play into a very homophobic agenda, insidiously, actually, when you really sort of unravel it and think deeper about that. I'm not saying all homosexual relationships are good. I'm saying some can be productive and wholesome and full of love and support and nurturing, and I've seen many examples of that, and I've experienced them myself. So I do think that it is a choice, but I think there's also, if I'm honest, potentially cultural and social impact that influences our lives, but how aware we are of that influence can change. When you're older, your brain's more developed. By the age of 24, it's fully developed. So as you get older, your ability to think rationally and to look back and to comprehend things differently, perhaps is different, and you've met more people, there's more perception, and so there's more chance of looking at it and sort of like discovering and investigating more thoroughly why you've actually made those decisions consciously. So I do argue that it is homosexuality and bisexuality as well, therefore, that they are choices. You could easily have refrained, despite peer pressure, despite everyone saying, you'd be weird and you'd be stupid, or you'd be something wrong with you if you remained celibate and had no sex or no sexual relations with anyone. You could have done that. I could have done that. Nobody forced or coerced me at that point. But I wasn't aware of the influences that led up to that at the same time as well. But I actively did make those choices. I made the choices to go out and seek people, to meet them, and to engage in those relationships, emotionally, physically, sexually. And so, those are choices that I made, some good, some bad. And, I have to live now with the consequences of that. And just like I've chosen the last 10 years to be celibate and to have no relationships with anyone, that was a conscious decision. And, in the same respect, I could have made that choice not to have any relationships, So I would suggest it is a relationship. Moving on to the actual, in terms of the paedophile thing, I think it is something that is the same in terms of being a social influence and absolutely a choice as well. But I think as well, I'm not trying to equate the same, homosexuality and paedophilia. They're certainly nothing like each other. One involves having consensual partners that are able to understand and that are mature enough physically and psychologically. Whereas paedophilia, they are not, of course. That is what makes it both illegal and immoral. And because it's unconsensual, because the children are not able to understand the decision that they're being made, and they're often coerced or groomed, of course, into that. So the responsibility is with the adults to protect those children, and anyone using that excuse that that the genetics determine them to do that. It's a real cop-out, and it won't wash with me, and I hope it won't wash any court of law either, because no one makes you go out and meet people or have relationships or engage in any of that kind of behaviour, except perhaps at a very young age. And I think that, that sadly does happen with some people. Some people that are sexually abused at an early age, and that certainly does have an influence with some people. And one study that I read actually suggests that some people sexually abused are more likely to go on to also sexually abuse, but there's many others that don't do that as well. As many people that sexually abused children that were never abused as well, oddly enough. So really, I think it does come down to personal responsibility on the whole. But I think we need to be very cautious before giving too much weight to any genetic factor, really, and using that as an excuse to get away with doing whatever, or to excuse ourselves of taking the responsibility for our behaviour and that. And we all need to be mindful and wary of the dangers that some people do pose to children and young adults, older children or teenagers or adolescents who are particularly impressionable and vulnerable to older adults that may want to use them. So it's a duty to all of us to look out for them and to sort of, to where we can, be mindful to sort of to look after them wherever we can, in whatever way, actually. And for those people that do have those feelings for whatever reason, they need to control those and be responsible for stopping themselves. You're not a slave to your thoughts. I have terrible, angry thoughts sometimes. Somebody's really wronged me or angered me, and I feel like I want to bloody well hurt that person sometimes. Or I feel like, I have a really nasty, angry thought. But I have to control that. I can't just use that as an excuse. I can't then go off and say, oh, well, that's what provoked me into doing that. I'm still responsible for how I allow my thoughts, how much I dwell on my thoughts, and how I allow them to act on my actions. So we need to be emphasizing personal responsibility and empowering people through stressing, how important choice is in our day-to-day lives and in our relationships, especially with other people, especially in our sexual relationships too, and considering what impact that has on others as well as ourselves.